Welcome, everyone. We're super happy that you've made time to join us today. We'll just let everyone take time to join. And in the meantime, we would love to know who you are, where you're joining us from, the organization or collective or movement that you're part of, and why you've joined today and what you're keen to learn about. And we do have interpretation in French, Spanish, and Portuguese. So if those are your languages, please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom as we get started. Wow, it's exciting to see how many people are here. Great. All right, well, actually, since we're already so many people, we might we might get started. So everyone, please introduce yourselves in the chat. And welcome everyone to the launch of the report Gender, Debt, and Fossil Fuels, a mapping of key insights from the African continent, written by Bagata and Dr. Amira Sawas, and a collab between the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative and AFRODAD, the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. We're super excited you've joined us here today. And as I was saying, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, where you're joining from, the collective movement or organization that you're part of, why you've joined today, and what you would love to learn more about. And just as a reminder that we're recording the session so that those who were not able to join today can still listen in. And we also want to give a big thank you and acknowledge Comic Relief and indeed Alison Robertshaw and her team for their support of this research. It's so important that funders are willing to support Global South scholars in researching and articulating the challenges and opportunities of their own contexts and constituencies. And in this case, there was brilliant work out there that was critical to understanding cross-cutting injustices related to debt, gender, and fossil fuels, but it needed to be synthesized and then platformed to enable discussions about the solutions. So we're really pleased that Comic Relief sees the value in platforming the work of African feminist experts, and they've set a great example that we hope others will follow. My name is Sabla Samuel. I'm the head of Africa Campaigns and Advocacy at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. I'm based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I'll be moderating the session with all of you today. And as I was saying at the beginning, we have interpretation to French, Portuguese, and Spanish. So please click on the globe icon and below if you want interpretation to any of those three languages and select the language of your choice. We are really lucky today to be joined by powerful speakers, debt experts, and feminist movement builders who understand profoundly through experience and practice that nothing happens in isolation, and that for power, resources, wealth, and justice to be redistributed and truly reparative, we must face and tackle the overlapping crises of gender injustice, debt entrapment, and fossil fuel extraction, not as isolated forms of violence and injustice, but as intersecting, overlapping, and reinforcing crises in order to build a truly feminist decolonial green economy. Today, we will be guided by Pan-African researcher and campaigner Bemnet Agata, who will take us through the main insights and findings of this new report. And you'll hear from economic justice campaigners, debt experts, and feminist movement builders from across our continent who are tackling the intersecting crises of debt, gender, and fossil fuels head on to build eco-feminist futures. I will now take a moment to introduce you to our incredible speakers, and then we can get started. And please feel free in the meantime to put any questions that you might have directly in the chat. Today, we are lucky to have with us, as I just mentioned, Bemnet Agata of the Tax Justice Network and lead author of the report Gender, Debt, and Fossil Fuels, a mapping of key insights from the African continent. Morosi Kanyomate, Economic Justice and Climate Action Associate at Akina Mama wa Africa. Dr. Mela Chiponda, Director of Shine Collab, and Riska Koopman, Policy Research and Advocacy Officer on International Public and Private Finance at the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. Our continent is currently facing a soaring debt crisis shaped by an ongoing legacy of colonial extraction with cascading harms to women. This system of plunder and extraction must be tackled at its root for a truly transformative shifts to be possible, and the proposals and visions from Pan-African feminists are essential to building this roadmap. In this way, this new report collects these African feminist proposals and ideas to map our way out of the crisis. We will now turn to Bernat Agata first, a Pan-African researcher and campaigner based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Her work explores the intersections of debt, tax, and climate justice through a feminist political economy lens, with a focus on alternatives to austerity. She is a public relations and communication specialist at the Tax Justice Network. And Bemnet is the author of the new report, Gender, Debt, and Fossil Fuels, a mapping of key insights from the African continent, being launched today in the lead up to International Women's Day and the Commission on the Status of Women. Femnet will share with us the highlights and key findings from this report on the systemic and overlapping crises of debt injustice, gendered harm, and the fossil fuel economy, while proposing pathways for a gender-just future. Over to you, Femnet.
Thank you so much, Sabla. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I really appreciate all of you being here, and I'm excited for the opportunity to learn from one another in this space. I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank my wonderful co-author, Dr. Amira Sawas, for her support and guidance. And thank you to all those that took the time to rigorously review the project. So I'll start. So if you could start the slides, that would be great. Right, gender, debt, and fossil fuel, a mapping of key insights from the African continent. You can go to the next slide. So I'd like to begin with this. Africa, as we know, is being told to drill its way out of debt, and women are paying the hidden costs. So over the next few minutes, we'll trace the systems that produce this outcome and consider what it requires of us to contest and transform it. Next slide. So as Sebla mentioned, Africa is at the front line of global polycrisis, rising debt distress, intensifying climate impacts, renewed fossil fuel expansion, and deepening inequality. So what is missing from mainstream policy debate, however, is how these dynamics are structurally connected and how gender sits at the center of that connection. So this report demonstrates that debt repayment, fossil fuel expansion, and gendered labor form a single political economy. So this report asks several things. So the first one being, what happens when debt repayments becomes the overriding economic priority? How does fossil fuel expansion reemerge under debt pressure? How are adjustments costs redistributed into whom? How do debt, extraction, and gendered labor operate together? And lastly, what structural shifts are required to move beyond this debt-conditioned extractivism toward the gender justice transition? So I'm going to share some key findings. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So finding number one, the overarching finding we found is that debt operates as a structural constraint on economic policy and development choices. Africa's external debt has doubled since 2020 to over $1 trillion. In 2024, 34 African countries spent more on external debt payments than on health or education, and debt repayments consumed at least 18.5% of government's revenues, the highest level in 25 years. In 27 countries, interest payments alone exceed 10% of revenues. And Zambia's 2021 budget illustrates the scale of these trade-offs, right? 39% of total expenditure was allocated to debt servicing, more than the combined budgets for education, health, water, and sanitation. So the key issue is not only the size of the debt, but its structure, right? Around 60% of developing country debt is owned to private creditors, commercial banks, and bondholders, rather than concessional lenders. These debts are typically denominated in foreign currency, carry higher interest rates, and are exposed to refinancing risk, credit rating pressures, and potential litigation in international courts. Many sovereign bonds are issued under English or New York law, allowing private creditors to pursue legal enforcement outside of the debt country's jurisdiction. So during Ethiopia's recent debt restructuring, which followed its default on the country's €1 billion bond after failing to make a scheduled payment, a group of private bondholders said it would take legal action in English courts to recover unpaid principal and interest when negotiations stalled and proposed restructuring deal was rejected. This episode illustrates how sovereign debt distress can quickly escalate into legal confrontation in foreign jurisdictions. The fact that these disputes are governed by English or New York law reflects the persistence of a post-colonial financial order in which legal and monetary authority remains anchored in historic centers of imperial power. So for African countries, the structure is particularly punishing. The continent faces some of the highest sovereign borrowing costs in the world, with many governments paying double-digit interest rates on international bonds, even when their debt to GDP ratio are lower than those of advanced economies. This means scarce public revenues are diverted not simply to service debt, but to compensate private investors for perceived risk, compressing fiscal space and narrowing governments' room to pursue developmental and redistributive policy. Under these conditions, debt service becomes politically and financially untouchable, right? Governments cannot easily restructure or defer repayments without risk-credit downgrades, exclusion from international capital markets, or potential legal action in foreign courts, as we've seen in Ethiopia. As a result, fiscal policy is reorganized around maintaining repayment credibility, producing brutal trade-offs in which essential public services are dismantled simply to stay afloat. So that's finding number one, and we'll go to finding number two. So if you could go to the next slide. The finding we found was debt locks economies into extractive export traps. So it's really important to look at Africa's current debt crisis sitting within a longer economic structure shaped by colonial extraction and later reinforced by structural adjustment programs. So colonial economies were organized around exporting raw materials with little domestic processing or value addition. In the 1980s, structural adjustment programs deepened this outward-facing model through trade liberalization, privatization, and export-led growth, reversing earlier import substitution efforts aimed at building this domestic manufacturing capacity. So when we come to today, foreign currency sovereign debt continues that discipline. So Africa's external debt, as I mentioned, has surpassed $1 trillion US, and much of it must be repaid in dollars or euros. Governments therefore prioritize sectors that generate foreign exchange quickly. To give you context, around 60% of Africa's exports remain primary commodities, reinforcing a pattern in which oil, gas, and minerals are extracted for international markets, while manufactured goods and refined fuels are imported. Nigeria illustrates this clearly, right? Despite being one of Africa's largest crude oil producers, it has historically imported around 70 to 80% of its refined petroleum products, exporting crude while buying back fuel at higher prices. This sustains trade deficits, currency volatility, and dependence on external demand. So we see that the paradox is really stark, right? Here we are with Africa holding roughly 30% of global mineral reserves, 65% of the world's arable land, and about 60% of global solar potential, yet receives less than 2% of global renewable investments. And to make this worse, around 600 million Africans still lack electricity, while approximately 60% of projected oil and gas extraction is controlled by multinational corporations headquartered outside the continent and structurally primary around export contracts rather than domestic energy provision. So we clearly see that fossil fuel expansion is not delivering energy access for African populations. Yet under tightening fiscal space driven by volatile markets, rising interest rates, and climate shocks, extraction consistently we see across the continent is re-emerging as a dominant policy response because it promises hard currency earnings tied to export sales. So what this does is it creates a structural trap. Dependence on commodity export exposes economies to global price swings. When prices fall, export earnings decline, lower earnings weaken the currency, a weaker currency increases the local cost of repaying dollar-denominated debt. So higher debt burdens then pushes governments to expand extraction to generate more foreign exchange. And ironically and sadly, climate finance often intensifies rather than breaks this grueling cycle, right? More than 2/3 is delivering delivered as loans, and between 2021 and 2023, Sub-Saharan Africa paid over twice as much in debt service as it received in climate finance. In 2023, 32 countries spent more servicing debt than they received in climate finance. So rather than enabling diversification, domestic transformation, and a gender-just transition, current financial flows are deepening dependence on commodity export structured for external demand. So we'll go to finding number 3. So the last finding is this central piece, which is debt and extraction persists because women absorb the costs. Gender inequality does not begin with extraction. Discriminatory land systems, unequal labor markets, entrenched care burdens, and the persistence of patriarchal norms already constrain women's security and autonomy. So when debt pressure narrows fiscal space, fossil fuel expansion becomes the primary organizing response, these pre-existing inequalities and dynamics intensify. One sphere where this intensification becomes visible is land. Across Africa, women make up between 40 to 50% of agricultural labor, 66% of sub-Saharan Africa, yet own less than 20% of land. As extractive projects expand, women are frequently excluded from compensation schemes and decision-making. So land government systems rooted in colonial patriarchal law exclude women from ownership and formal title. So when oil, gas, or mineral projects displace communities, compensation flows to male title holders, leaving many women without restitution or recognized claims to lost livelihoods. At the same time, austerity shifts the burden of adjustment, as we saw, onto households and onto women in particular. When governments cut health care, water provision, childcare for subsidies, food subsidies, and social protection, the responsibilities don't vanish, right? They are transferred into households where women already perform nearly 3 times more unpaid care work than men. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, women and girls spend an estimated 40 billion hours each year collecting water, unpaid labor equivalent to a full year of South Africa's entire workforce. So water must still be collected, food must still be grown and prepared, children, the elderly and sick must be cared for. Through this transfer of labor from the state to household, women's time and labor becomes the hidden buffer that sustains sovereign debt repayments to international creditors. So the economic restructuring is also accompanied by securitization. So what I mean by that is extraction sites are secured and controlled. Oil fields, pipelines, and mines are guarded by militaries, private security firms, and in some contexts guarded by paramilitary groups tasked with protecting infrastructure and investor interests. Communities are surveilled, protest is restricted, large male labor influxes reshape local economies and power relations. Where social protections are weak, gender-based violence rises. So in these contexts, violence is not incidental. We see how it is a core part of how extraction is enforced. The violence is also epistemic. The violence extends to knowledge itself. Extraction regimes elevate male-dominated technical expertise as the only legitimate knowledge. Community evidence of pollution, illness, or land degradation is dismissed as anecdotal, emotional, even obstructionist. So indigenous ecological knowledge is treated as unscientific. Women who document harm are discredited, and this epistemic violence restricts who is allowed to define reality and therefore who is allowed to contest it. These material conditions reflect what feminist scholars call petromasculinity. So petromasculinity essentially is the fusion of fossil fuel extraction regimes, authoritarian politics, and patriarchal control. Extraction is defended through securitization, repression of dissent, and the criminalization of women, environmental human rights defenders. Development is, in a sense, framed in nationalist terms, while communities who question drilling or mining are cast as anti-progress. So control over land and resources becomes intertwined with control over women's bodies. And to add on to this, feminist analysis of capitalism and social reproduction shows that moments of economic restructuring are rarely gender neutral. Shifts in property regimes and extractive expansion are often accompanied by intensified efforts to discipline women through stigma, legal repression, accusations of immorality or deviance, and violence, particularly when they challenge dispossession. So across fossil fuel frontiers in Africa today, these dynamics are visible in the targeting of women who resist fossil fuel expansion and the land seizures that accompany it. This is why the death extractivism model is gendered at its core. Women are treated as infinitely elastic shock absorbers, expected to stretch when the state withdraws, to endure when land is taken, and to remain silent when harm is denied. So to put all of these things into perspective, I will give two practical case studies. If we could go to the next slide, please. So one of the case studies we'll be looking at is Malawi. So Malawi in 2023 allocated approximately $791 million to external debt repayment. This amount was nearly double what the government spent on education and almost 4 times in total health expenditure. With fiscal resources tightly constrained, the governments did not recruit hundreds of newly trained nurses into the public health system, despite significant staffing needs across the country. As a result, hospitals and clinics operate with persistent shortages of personnel, medicines, essential equipment. Reproductive and maternal health services are particularly affected. Facilities struggle to provide consistent antenatal care, emergency obstetric services, and postnatal support. So maternal mortality rises in already under-resourced settings where health infrastructure is fragile. Education is similarly affected. Education budgets remain limited and households are required to cover a large share of school-related expenses, including uniforms, materials, and transport. In context of financial hardship, we see long travel distances to schools. Girls are more likely to withdraw from education to support household labor and caregiving. So reduced schooling increases vulnerability to early marriage and adolescent pregnancy with long-term consequences for economic security and health outcomes. And the second example I'll give is Mozambique. Mozambique is a unique case where it illustrates how climate shocks, debt pressures, and fossil fuel expansion reinforce one another. After Cyclone Idai in 2019, instead of receiving large-scale debt cancellation, or grant-based climate finance, Mozambique took on $118.2 million IMF emergency loan, adding to existing fiscal pressures. With limited recovery funding and rising external obligations, the government increasingly promoted large-scale liquefied natural gas exports in a region called Capo Delgado as a source of foreign currency earnings. The Mozambique LNG project, led by Total Energies and structured primarily for export to European and Asian markets, was advanced as a pathway to generate export revenues and support macroeconomic recovery. As LNG revenues became embedded in fiscal planning and debt repayment expectations, protecting extraction sites and infrastructure assumed growing strategic importance. Gas facilities and surrounding territories are heavily securitized by Mozambican forces, foreign military support, and private contractors tasked with protecting production and transport routes. In this context, violence is not peripheral to extraction but intertwined with it. Allegations of detention and abuse linked to security operations have been largely documented, while women in surrounding communities reported heightened risk of sexual violence, coercion, and exploitation. The securitized environment reshapes local social dynamics. So as we saw earlier, the influx of predominantly male construction workers, security personnel, and military forces alters labor markets in everyday life. The sudden shift from subsistence livelihoods to cash-based transaction alongside wage disparities favoring incoming workers produced gender-differentiated vulnerabilities. So displaced men often face unemployment or recruitment into informal security and transport work, while displaced women excluded from land compensation and formal employment opportunities were channeled into informal trading, low-paid services roles, and in some documented cases, transactional sex as a survival strategy. So these gendered outcomes were structured by land governance itself. Land acquisition for LNG infrastructure displaced farming and fishing communities, and compensation processes prioritized formal male title holders. Women reliant on customary land access for subsistence agriculture are frequently excluded from restitution. As rural livelihoods erode and public spending remains constrained by debt servicing, unpaid care burdens intensify. Women, again in Mozambique, absorb the combined pressure of land loss, informalization, and weakened public provision. So taken together in both of these cases, in Mozambique, we see these dynamics illustrate petromasculinity in practice, right? Fossil fuel extraction secured through militarized governance, male-dominated authority structures, and the consolidation of control over land, labor, and community life. We also see how climate shock borrowing and export-led extraction thus operate in tandem, while the burdens of adjustment are redistributed again into women's land, labor, and bodily security. We can go to the next slide, Zoe. Thank you. So when we look at all of these dynamics, all three findings, we see how they form one overlapping political economy under conditions of external debt repayment, fossil fuel expansion, and gender inequality converge into a single political economy. Debt obligations prioritize foreign currency earnings, pushing governments towards oil and gas projects that generate dollar quickly. Fossil fuel revenues are then channeled back into servicing debt. This creates a self-reinforcing debt and fossil fuel trap in which gender, labor, and vulnerability stabilize that system. In this way, fiscal survival becomes tied to continued extraction, effectively locking African countries into fossil fuel dependence and closing off pathways to diversification and a gender-just transition. Debt conditionality restructured economic governance around extraction. Sovereign credit worthiness, budget stability, and infrastructure investments are made contingent on project fossil fuel revenues. This deepens exposure to commodity volatility and the growing risk of stranded assets as the global economy is shifting away from carbon. So when prices fall, revenues underperform, or projects fail to deliver anticipated returns, fiscal space again tightens. To keep repayment on track, public spending on health, education, and social protection is reduced. The state withdraws, households compensate. This is where gender becomes structurally central. As public systems shrink, care work expands, water must be still collected, food must still be produced, children and sick must still be cared for. And as I mentioned earlier, perform nearly 3 times more unpaid care work than men, and an estimated 708 million globally are excluded from paid employment because of care responsibilities. When we look at sub-Saharan Africa, 89% of women work in informal employment with minimal protections under austerity. These burdens intensify. So again, we see women's unpaid labor absorbs the social costs of fiscal compression. Their time and incomes insecurity prevents immediate social rupture, but their repayment schedules still hold. So extraction reinforces this dynamic. Land acquisitions frequently exclude women from compensation, male-dominated labor influxes increasing living costs and heightened risk of gender-based violence. Security forces and private contractors are deployed to protect infrastructure and investor interests restricting protest. So women environmental human rights defenders often become the last line of defense, physically placing themselves between communities and extractive projects. The threats and violence they face function to deter resistance and secure the continuity of revenue flows. So when we bring all of these large, complex ideas together, the reinforcing mechanism is clear, right? Debt obligations push fossil fuel expansion. Fossil fuel expansions generate volatile revenues. Revenue volatility justifies further borrowing and austerity. Austerity transferred adjustment costs to women. Women's unpaid labor and heightened vulnerability stabilize the system, almost with brutal efficiency, right? So the debt fossil fuel trap is therefore gendered at its core. It persists because the costs required to maintain it are distributed downwards and inward onto women's labor, land, and bodies. The next slide, please. So as depressing as all of these things are, it's really important to know that women are not passive victims. They are political actors. We are political actors reshaping energy futures. So across Africa, women-led resistance is organized strategically and financially targeted. In the Niger Delta, Ogoni women occupied oil facilities to expose environmental destruction and militarization. They deliberately mobilized their role as mothers, organizing youth, and framing extraction as a threat to their children's future in order to strengthen community legitimacy and intergenerational resistance. And similarly, in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province, women activists within the Say No to Gas campaign have documented land dispossession, forced displacements, and militarization linked to the LNG expansion. They've challenged the 20 billion USD Mozambique LNG project led by Total Energies by building alliances across more than 20 countries, targeting export credit agencies, commercial banks, and multinational corporations financing the project. So by linking local testimonies to global financial advocacy, they have increased scrutiny of fossil fuel financing and delayed aspects of the project rollout in a context marked by insurgency, mass displacement, and rising sovereign debt. We also look at Lamu. Similarly, in Kenya's Lamu County, the Lamu Women Alliance played a leading role within the Save Lamu coalition, opposing the proposed 1,050 megawatt coal-fired power plant. Women mobilized fishing and trading communities, raised concern about the threats to livelihoods, health, and cultural heritage, and challenged deficiencies in the project's environmental and social impact assessment. Through sustained protest and litigation before Kenya's National Environment Tribunal, campaigners secured a landmark 2019 ruling revoking the plant's environmental license, effectively halting the project and affirming community consultation and environmental safeguards. Next slide, please. So when we look at the structural ways forward, I call this slide international cooperation shifting from entrapment to sovereignty. And I really want to highlight that international cooperation is a key pathway moving forward. And one of the paths is this upcoming first international conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels in Santa Marta, Colombia, which will be taking place next month. This conference offers a rare opportunity to confront fossil fuels as a global political problem rather than a series of national development fixes. Its significance lies not only in coordinating a phase out of oil, gas, and coal, but in reshaping the international conditions that have made extraction appear fiscally unavoidable for many African states. Yet confronting fossil fuel as a global political problem also requires confronting the gendered economic structures that sustain them. A gender-just transition cannot rest on a fiscal system that relies on women's unpaid labor, dispossession, and exposure to violence to remain solvent. An economy that excludes women from land, financing, and decision-making, yet depends on our precarity to function, cannot deliver justice simply by shifting to a different energy regime. So these gendered inequalities are inseparable from the financial structures that shape development pathways. That cancellation without structural transformation is only a temporary relief. So the roots of recurring debt crises lie in an externally oriented economic model shaped by colonial extraction and reinforced by post-colonial development strategies centered on primary commodity exports. Seen together, these dynamics reveal that debt, trade, tax, climate injustice are not separate crises, but interlocking features of the same system. The costs are shifted into unpaid care work, informal labor, land dispossession, and environmental harm disproportionately borne by women. Because these injustices are structurally interconnected, they cannot be dismantled through isolated national reforms alone. Grassroots mobilization and domestic change are vital, but they operate within a global economic order that constrains their reach. So rewriting the rules of the global economic order requires sustained international cooperation, working in tandem with local resistance. So when I say shifting from entrapment to sovereignty, therefore requires coordinated structural change across 4 areas. First, debt restructuring must change what fiscal space is used for. Relief that simply restores repayment capacity without altering public investment priorities risks stabilizing the same extractive model. Resources freed from debt should be redirected towards climate resilience, public care systems, and long-term domestic capacity, rather than servicing external creditors or subsidizing new extractive projects. Second, international tax cooperation must curb corporate tax abuse, trade misinvoicing, and financial secrecy. So research from my organization by the Tax Justice Network finds between 2016 and 2021, multinational corporations' corporate tax abuse resulted in an estimated $1.7 trillion in global revenue losses. In Africa alone, illicit financial flows are estimated at nearly $89 billion annually, with a substantial share linked to trade misinvoicing and profit shifting in commodity and extractive sectors. These revenue leakages erode fiscal space in countries already facing high debt burdens and climate vulnerability. So for developing countries that require over $1 $0.3 trillion annually for climate and development financing, reclaiming even a fraction of these lost resources would reduce reliance on fossil fuel expansion as a source for foreign exchange. Third, fossil fuel phase-out frameworks must address the financial structures that drive extraction. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty offers an important pathway for coordinating a managed and equitable global phase-out while supporting governments through that transition. One proposal under discussion is introduction of levies on fossil fuel producers in high-emitting countries, with revenues redistributed to Global South countries implementing just transition plans. Such financing could help replace lost fossil fuel revenues without pushing countries to open new extractive frontiers. It also aligns with the broader tax justice demands, recognizing that fair taxation and international cooperation are essential to financing climate action. Together, these mechanisms could create fiscal space for domestic revenue mobilization, public investments in care system, and renewable infrastructure and industrial policies that support economic diversification. Lastly, structural transformation must operate at a regional pan-African scale. As economist Fadel Kaboub argues, recurring debt crises stem from three structural deficits: energy deficits, food deficits, and the absence of high value-added manufacturing. These deficits are structural drivers of recurring debt crises. So they generate chronic trade imbalances, weaken currencies, and push governments into foreign currency borrowing, making fossil fuel extraction the fastest route to dollar and tying economies to raw material exports. So closing energy and food gaps and building regional manufacturing capacity through coordinated industrial policy across African regional blocs is therefore essential. Acting collectively also strengthens the bargaining power in global trade and financial negotiations, reducing vulnerability to external shocks and creditor pressure. Without shifting up the value chain and reducing dependency on primary commodity exports, debt relief will remain short-lived and countries will remain structurally confined to the lowest tiers of the global economy. African feminist movements are already articulating this integrated approach. The Feminist Action Nexus for Economic and Climate Justice identifies 6 interconnected levers: just transition, debt justice, trade justice, wealth redistribution, democratizing global financial governance, and curbing corporate power over public goods. So moving forward, the Santa Marta Conference and parallel negotiations on global economic reform, including the UN Tax Convention that's ongoing currently, offer rare openings to embed these principles in emerging frameworks. Transitions cannot be measured in carbon metrics alone and must confront the fiscal dependency, capital mobility, and the gendered organization of production and social reproduction. If global rules continue to privilege creditor rights, financial secrecy, and profit shifting by the multinational corporations, African economies will remain dependent on extraction, and women will continue to subsidize macroeconomic stability through unpaid labor. So to conclude, shifting from entrapment to sovereignty means redesigning the rules that determine who extracts value, who captures revenue, and who absorbs crisis. Without that structural transformation, energy transition risks becoming another chapter in the same extractive story. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Femnet. That was incredibly powerful. And I think you'll see in the chat that everyone's been so excited about everything that you've shared and is also asking for the slides and the recording. And we will be able to share that with everyone. But just thank you so much for such a powerful presentation, sharing the deep insights and exposing how intricately and structurally the injustices between debt, gender, and fossil fuels are truly connected. You had really powerful lines on how women stabilize the system with brutal efficiency. And thank you so much also for showing those 3 interconnected findings and also mapping a way out of this crisis, guided by the experience and leadership of Pan-African feminists, and how much we need to have that as a critical pathway in the energy transition, and that it's not possible to kind of replicate these same systems of extraction with a new energy regime. So thank you so much for everything you've just shared. And to map our way forward, we wanted to also share why these findings are also incredibly important for us as an initiative. grounded in international cooperation, global justice, and equity. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, as you also shared, holds the objective of catalyzing international cooperation towards a just, financed, and equitable transition from fossil fuels in line with the 1.5-degree climate target, um, towards cooperative and decentralized and people-centered renewable futures. And we don't have all the solutions, which is why we were in this process of ideation and consultation, to hear from the experiences on the front lines, to hear from the experiences from decision makers in different countries, to understand the landscape of proposals and solutions like you've shared beyond the fossil crisis that put economic justice and gender justice at the center. And I think this is why this kind of experience is also so important, to gather these pathways, and be guided by these proposals and mechanisms, as ideas and mechanisms that could be part of a fossil fuel treaty or that the initiative could hold, and the proposals that we can put forward to governments, the participating nations of the initiative, who will ultimately be the ones to negotiate a fossil fuel treaty. And we want these proposals to be in line with what the global justice movements and what feminist movements demand and expect and want. So, for example, our research and policy team has commissioned an independent expert group just transition finance that was established at the end of 2024. And all of these experts come from across the global south and have different areas of expertise, such as trade, debt, finance, industrial policy, and South-South cooperation. And we're working with them to design ideas around mechanisms that the treaty could offer to members in these key areas. So we've worked under the stream of debt management and alleviating fiscal constraints, because I think you've showed so clearly how much fiscal space is swallowed by debt repayments, and then there is no space left over for necessary public expenditures around health and education. So we've worked on the stream of debt management and alleviating fiscal constraints with debt and macro economic justice, on exploring the potential approach to debt resolution that a new treaty may have to offer. And there are different areas of debt resolution material that a treaty could support or enable. And these could be grounded in a debt resolution facility platformed in a fossil fuel treaty, offering support to member states to assess, review, and renegotiate their debts, as well as implement more transparent and accountable deals with different creditors. And another example is connecting governments with plans for key projects to enable their energy transition with impact investors, like the Journey Fund, for example, that was recently launched as a fund to match fossil fuel treaty commitments with private investment commitments to realize a just energy transition that builds post-fossil economies. And the pilot in Latin America was able to fund solar access to around 50,000 people in the Colombian Amazon. And we know also, as you've shared, that African feminists and broader feminists internationally have been calling for a feminist decolonial green economy, as you mentioned, the 6 central elements of just transitions: debt justice, trade justice, wealth and resource redistribution, democratization of the global financial architecture, and ending the predatory corporate power over public goods and services. And many of these demands are finally on the global agenda, and we're looking at many of these elements in our work to shape a fossil fuel treaty. For example, how could trade mechanisms within a fossil fuel treaty support the demands for trade justice? And that's why it's so important for us as an initiative to learn from feminist experts who have been at the forefront and cutting edge of these overlapping crises and solutions for a long time, and ideating and shaping together the path forward. And that's why we want to work in partnership, because we know this is a process of collective ideation, and we want to make sure that by the time governments sit down to negotiate a treaty, it's clear what mechanisms they should be putting at the table that are shaped by and clearly aligned with what global justice movements and feminist movements are calling for. So we've commissioned this research on mapping these intersections between the overlapping polycrises of debt, gender, and fossil fuels as a structural problem. And as you said, structural problems need structural solutions, international cooperation solutions, with transformative ideas, visions, and solutions. So this may be a key resource for our movements and decision makers, and also provide ideas for potential solutions in international cooperation, financing, and justice. So now, to go back to you, to our amazing panelist, I would also like to ask you all, based on your experience, what forms of international cooperation are needed to realize gender just transitions and a feminist decolonial green economy vision as African feminists have put out into the world. We want to continue to learn from African feminists who are at the forefront in shaping these visions and take these learnings into international cooperation and start to shift the kinds of solutions that are being put on the table so that they are consistent with and honor these principles. So we will start with the incredible, the visionary Dr. Mela Chiponda, who is a leader with strong ecofeminist politics and over 20 years of experience working across the African continent and globally on energy, climate, land, and water justice. A recognized expert in the field, she has authored influential papers, policy briefs, advocacy documents on climate, land, debt, economic justice, and energy, all through an ecofeminist lens, holding a PhD in development studies with a focus on renewable energy, along with a master's degree and multiple graduate and postgraduate qualifications. Mela brings a wealth of experience in strategy formulation and operationalization, Her leadership is rooted in a commitment to feminist care and well-being in the workplace, fostering organizational cultures that provide and prioritize collective care, sustainability, and transformative justice. With deep experience in movement building, political advocacy, and systemic change, Mela continues to work at the intersection of gender, ecology, and economic justice to advance a just and sustainable future. So thank you so much, and over to you, Mela.
Thank you very much, Seble, and thank you so much, Bem and Amira, for the very brilliant report. The report actually speaks to the realities of what is on the ground, and just to go back to the African ecofeminist perspective, like what Seble has said. International cooperation must move beyond technocratic partnerships and instead cultivate relationships that are grounded in justice, in care, and historical accountability. The vision for a gender just transition and a feminist decolonial economy cannot be realized through the same global structures that produced ecological destruction, extractivism, and gendered inequalities in the first place. So cooperation must center epistemic justice. I think Bem already mentioned in the report, and it is there in the report, about the need to recognize African feminist knowledge systems, indigenous cosmologies, and community-based practices as legitimate foundations for climate and economic policy. Because too often the global climate governance structures, they privilege northern expertise while sidelining the lived knowledge of women who are already sustaining ecological systems through agroecology, through water stewardship, through seed protection and community energy initiatives. So international cooperation should therefore give priority to co-creation of knowledge with grassroots feminist movements rather than imposing externally designed solutions. And when we are talking about epistemic justice, I want just to push it a little bit to talk about the justice or the injustice that happens when someone's knowledge is dismissed or undervalued because of prejudice about their identity, about their gender, about their race, their class, their age. And the examples, some of which were shared by Bem in the report, that the way the system is structured and giving women as examples of women not being believed about their experiences, indigenous communities dismissed about warnings about environmental destruction, rural communities being treated as uninformed in climate policy discussions. The harm here is not just personal because it strips people of their status as credible knowers. And I also just want to, while I'm still at epistemic justice, I just want to, a little bit to just draw our attention to hermeneutical injustice, where people lack the language, the frameworks, or recognition to make sense of their experiences, often because the dominant systems never developed concepts to describe them, right? And I want to talk about when, for example, communities face slow violence from mining, they may struggle to prove cumulative ecological harm because the legal systems only recognize immediate damage. And therefore, epistemic injustice, it shapes it shapes the law whose testimony is admissible, or the science on what counts as evidence. And this is injustice which is often not spoken about. And I want to go back to the issue of international cooperation, which I believe meaningful cooperation requires structural economic transformation. This means reforming global financial systems that continue to trap African countries in debt while extracting critical minerals and natural resources for the global energy transition. Feminist movements have long been calling for climate finance that is grant-based, that is accessible to grassroots organizations, that is directed towards community-led renewable energy, care economies, and regenerative livelihoods. So international cooperation means just that, the global financial system speak to the needs of African women and the continent in general. And the last issue, which them also touched on in the report, which I also just want to connect to international cooperation, is about strengthening the transnational feminist solidarity and movement infrastructure. African women defending land and territories are confronting powerful corporate and geopolitical interests linked to mining, to energy, to agribusiness. International alliances between movements, legal advocates, researchers, funders is very critical and very essential to protect the defenders, to amplify local struggles, and build shared strategies for a just energy transition. And therefore, a feminist decolonial green economy will not emerge from markets alone. It will grow from collective care for land, water, and community, supported by international cooperation that redistributes power, resources, and voice to those who have been excluded from shaping the future. Thank you very much. Seble, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mela. And thank you so much for stressing how important it is that we own our knowledge systems and that these forms of knowing are also respected as African feminists, and also, as you were saying, uplifting indigenous cosmologies as legitimate foundations, and that these must be reflected in the forms also of international cooperation being proposed. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and your reflections with all of us. We will now move to Morozi Kanyomate, an African feminist lawyer and human rights advocate based in Kampala, Uganda. She holds a bachelor's of laws from Makerere University and has a strong interest in issues that relate to the rights of women and other marginalized people, building feminist economies and climate justice advocacy. She is currently serving as the Economic Justice and Climate Action Associate at Akina Mama wa Africa. So over to you, Morozi.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. Morozi Patricia Kanywamate with Kina Mama wa Africa under the Economic Justice and Climate Action Program. Just to say thank you to Bemnet and Amira for such a fantastic report, and also for giving us an excellent grounding for this conversation. So I'm just going to speak a little bit more on the gendered impacts of debt and austerity and how they fuel extractive economic systems before going into some of the approaches to decolonial feminist well-being economics. So I'll just like to take us a little bit back to situate the conversation on debt and austerity within the broader political economy that shapes development pathways on the African continent. So like the report highlights, debt is a part of the history of colonialism that organized our economies around extraction and outward flows of wealth, as well as a heavy dependence on volatile commodity markets. And so when debt levels rise, governments are often compelled to adopt austerity measures or policy reforms, which are promoted by international financial institutions. And this typically reduce public spending and call for privatization of essential services, labor market deregulation, and regressive taxation. So from a feminist perspective, the impact of these policies are always gendered. And feminist economics have spoken a lot about the triple burden or the triple jeopardy of austerity, where cuts to public spending reduce access to essential services such as healthcare, education, water, and social protection. And these are services that women disproportionately rely on because of their overrepresentation in poverty rates. So austerity also leads to job losses and the expansion of precarious employment. And this pushes women into informal and low paid work, which, as we know, comes without any social protections. And so when states withdraw from providing these services, then the responsibility for meeting those needs doesn't disappear. It's merely transferred to households. And most often women are the ones doing this unpaid care work, which was made very evident by the COVID-19 pandemic. So this expands women's time poverty and also further entrenches inequality. So globally, we know that social reproduction, which includes the work of raising children and caring for family members, the sick, and just generally sustaining households, among other forms of unpaid care work, constitutes a very massive but often invisible subsidy to the economy. And estimates from the International Labour Organization put this labor at 11 trillion US dollars annually, and yet it remains excluded from the way we measure economic productivity and growth. Because it is invisible within the conventional economic indicators such as GDP, then that means it's going to be ignored in macroeconomic policy decisions, which again is going to impact women and African women and just women all over women globally. So the result is also that this policy is designed to stabilize the economy or to repay debt, then end up deepening gender inequality while simultaneously undermining the very social systems that sustain life and also economies depend. So as the 2023 report by Debt Justice shows, many countries facing high debt burdens are often encouraged by global north-dominated institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank to expand commodity exports in order to generate foreign exchange and service their debts, like Bemnet already explained. And this is usually done through conditions which are attached to loans, pushing policies hinged on extractive development models that see natural resources such as fossil fuels as key to economic growth and development. And one such example is Uganda, where during COVID-19, the Ugandan government took a number of loans from the IMF and World Bank, including a loan for 1 billion US dollars in 2021 from the IMF, which according to the report, the conditions of the loan stipulated that the government should take a hands-off approach to the country's development and place greater priority on the oil and gas sector as a way of strengthening the country's collection of revenue and again repaying debt. And so in an effort to fast track oil and gas extraction, the Ugandan government then allocated the resources which were made available by the loan to the construction of the East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline, also known as ECOP, intended to transport oil from Uganda to Tanzania to enable the start of oil exploration. But as we know, and also as the report shows, these projects rarely deliver what they promise and often result in land dispossession, environmental degradation, displacement, destruction of the livelihoods of communities, and which has been well documented by land and environmental rights defenders. And again, women bear the brunt of these impacts, because when land is polluted or forests are cleared, it's women and girls who must travel even further to collect water or fuel, find alternative sources of fuel as well as food. And when communities are displaced, it's also women who absorb the increased burden of maintaining household under those conditions of uncertainty and poverty. So at the same time, like Dr. Melanie has spoken about, the global climate crisis is also driven by these historical emissions of industrialized economies. And this also intensifies the pressure on African economies. Which are now facing a very unjust paradox, where they are the most vulnerable to climate impacts and yet spending far more on servicing debt that they can invest in climate adaptation, or to even begin to speak of a just energy transition for Africa. And so under these conditions, again, expanding fossil fuel extraction is then sold to governments as the only available pathway to generate revenue, even when it undermines long-term sustainable development or ecological sustainability. And so this is why African feminists have increasingly argued that the problem is not one of financing, but the underlying extractivist economic model itself. And so a decolonial feminist well-being economics framework invites us to rethink the purpose of the economy altogether, and that instead of treating economic growth as an end in itself, we argue that economic systems should be assessed on their ability to sustain life, uphold dignity, and ensure the collective well-being of all people. And this is work that has been done by several decolonial feminists, such as Dr. Lebohan and Bhumika Muchala, and many others. And it also recognizes that indigenous communities have already been practicing and living by these principles time immemorial. So a decolonial feminist economics framework requires challenging also the artificial separation between production and social reproduction, which dominates mainstream economic thinking, and to recognize that the economy is not just about markets and profits, but about the everyday work that sustains people and communities, as well as women's unpaid care work. And so care, food production, ecological stewardship, and community knowledge are all foundational to economic life. And so from this feminist perspective, then the goal of economic policy should be to build economies that actually guarantee access to the essentials of life, such as food, shelter, health, education, and care, while remaining within the ecological limits of the planet. And such a transformation, again, requires confronting the colonial foundations of our current global economic systems. As we know, the wealth of the global north has historically been built through the extraction of resources and labor from the global south. And yet these same patterns are continuing today through global supply chains, resource exploitation, and unequal financial arrangements, like Femne talked about our current international tax system. And so a feminist well-being economy calls for the radical redistribution of wealth, power, and resources to address the structural inequalities which are produced by centuries of colonial plunder, which is why we must call for a just UN framework on international tax cooperation to begin addressing the decades of injustice embedded in the current international tax system that siphons wealth from the global south to the global north. And Akina Mama wa Africa also has a policy brief which highlights the feminist demands for a UN framework convention on tax, which work was also supported by the amazing Dr. Leila Latif on the Committee of Fiscal Studies. So it also requires us to redefine how we measure progress, and also a careful critique of the concept of development as a whole. So indicators such as GDP, which only capture market transactions, but they ignore the health of people, ecosystems, they ignore human rights, and the general being of people should be critiqued. So feminist approaches emphasize dignity, ecological balance, and social equity as central goals of economic policy. And so this brings us to the question of international cooperation. Part, I'll be talking about the financing for development process. So for those who took part, or even those who didn't, last year's fourth international conference on financing for development produced the Compromiso de Sevilla as its official outcome document. And so while the process was being presented as an opportunity to address systemic failures of the global financial architecture. Very many members of civil society and also global South governments and African governments raised concerns about the way the negotiations unfolded. There was limited transparency and a heavy reliance on informal negotiations, which weakened trust in the process, but also the ambitious proposals that were put forward by the global South and African countries as part of the Africa group, especially around debt restructuring and reforms to global economic governance, was significantly diluted in the final document. And instead of committing to transformative reforms, the outcome largely reiterated existing approaches. For example, the emphasis on mobilizing private finance through mechanisms such as blended finance, and often these instruments are presented as innovative solutions to close the financing gap, but evidence shown by the civil society, by the CSO FFD mechanism showed that these tend to shift financial risk onto the public sector and commodify essential services that poor people depend on, and also depend the debt burden. So for those of us advocating for gender just transitions and a decolonial green economy, this is obviously concerning. And we know that without structural reform to the international financial system, then countries will continue to face the same pressures that drive austerity and extractivism. So looking ahead to this year's Financing for Development Forum, it's critical to push for a different set of priorities. For example, there must be meaningful restructuring of the global financial architecture so that decision making becomes more just, democratic, and accountable. And the institutions that shape global economic policy should not be dominated by a handful of powerful countries. There must also be concrete mechanisms for addressing unsustainable debt burdens. Without debt justice, many countries will simply not have the fiscal space that's required to invest in care systems, in public services, or a just energy transition for Africa. So a feminist decolonial vision of the economy reminds us that the purpose of economic systems should never be to maximize profit or for perpetual growth, but to sustain life, which includes human life, community life, and the ecosystems upon which we all depend. Thank you. Over to you, Sabla.
Thank you so much, Morozi, about recentering the basic needs that we need from our economies to build economies that guarantee access to what basically subsists and holds and creates life in the framing of the decolonial feminist well-being economics that you shared. Thank you so much. I know we're going a bit over time, so I just wanted to flag for the speakers that there are some questions that have popped up in the Q&A box. And in case we don't have time to get to them verbally, I would really appreciate if you could just respond into the chat for any of the questions. There's one from Xiomara that asks if there's been any advances around care activities and policies and implementation. And there's been a question around how do we center justice in low carbon transition futures? What are the recommendations? And there's been questions about how do we make that fossil fuel levies actually reach local communities. So those are in the Q&A section. If any of the speakers want to get to them, feel free to respond to them in the chat. And then now we are going to turn to Riska Koopman, a Pan-African feminist serving as the International Public and Private Finance Officer at the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AFRODAD. She works towards a world where people's interests reign over profits, where public and private finance systems are just, transparent, and accountable, ensuring that resources are mobilized and distributed equitably to advance social and economic justice. With a deep commitment to gender-sensitive policies, Riska advocates for transformative financial reforms that dismantle systemic inequalities and empower communities across Africa and beyond. So thank you so much for being here, Riska, and over to you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, also the amazing paper, and to be part of this panel. I think I know that we are running short of time, so I'll try and make my intervention as quickly. So at a time when multilateralism is actively under threat, being reshaped and redefined by a few and for their benefit, the question of international cooperation and what we can do is very important, and this paper as well. What we are seeing is a tussle between the old world and new world, so like a time of monsters, right? But I'd like to contend that Africa has long been in this tussle. On the one hand, chained by colonial past and its tentacles, which has transmuted into a skewed and unfair global architecture, which my other panelists have spoken to. And on the other hand, a vibrant continent rooted in rich histories and also immense wealth in terms of minerals, people and ideas, as Dr. Miller has also spoken about. So in this time of monsters, I'd really like to offer some key reflections quickly on ways which can help us to birth a new world, which is not only shaped by African narratives, but also one which is finally beneficial to Africa. And I think this paper is radical in a way that it also offers us some pathways. And so the first point is that Bemet and Dr. Amira has really illustrated that Africa is not poor, it is institutionally plundered. We know that we have 30% of the world's mineral resources, renewable energy. We have vast oil, gas, and strategic minerals, but we are still one of the poorest regions in the world. More importantly, our external debt has surged to over 1 trillion USD over the last decade. And so this is the system. Then we see that wealth leaves and debt remains. And as this paper has also illustrated, it is women who have to pick up these policy failures. We also see that this extractive project has been rebranded as development finance. We've seen the surge of the resource-backed loans in countries like Zambia and Zimbabwe, and other conditionalities also referenced in the paper, which entrap our governments into this debt extractive logic. We also know that the global financial architecture is a continuation of this colonial rule. AFRED has also published a paper on this, and the points really do come out strongly that Africa today, we spend over half of our national budget on debt servicing, instead of critical services like health and education. So this is another form of colonialization. The amount the price that we pay for our debt is also then a form of discrimination, right? Because we know that European countries borrow maybe at 2 or 3%, whilst this is at 15 or 16% for African countries. And so this is deeply embedded into the global financial architecture. And at a national and a continental level, we know that this is at deep odds with our national and continental development agendas. And so we also then have to ask, why then do our development agencies and development banks like the African Development Bank still then pour money into oil and gas projects when we know that this deepens our crisis? And so we also have to be very clear in mapping this pathway forward, the role that we as Africans want development finances institutions to play. And we also saw recently, maybe in a more comical way, the bloop that Spoor and Fitch made in erasing Uganda and merging other countries in the map, which they had for their recent publication. But this has real implications for countries, because these ratings, which are maybe more arbitrary than anything else, have real bearing on what countries' rates they can borrow at. And this then in turn has real impacts on the services, the basket of goods and services they can offer to their citizens. And so coming back to this debt, this overbearing amount of debt, we know from our own research at Aphrodite that much of this debt is odious, it's illegitimate, and should be rejected. But we also know that from this paper and also our own research, that women are truly paying the price of this debt. We know that this is economic violence. We know that this violence is gendered. And also, for example, when the austerity that Murizi spoke about, is also gendered. When governments in Uganda, in Zambia, cut healthcare, cut critical services, the tech bros working in Silicon Valley, the hedge fund bros, the lawyers in Jersey, they don't take pay cuts. It's mothers who pick up extra shifts. It's grandmothers who go out onto the road to sell scones and fed cook in South Africa. It's women like me and you who have to do more care work to bridge this gap. It's women walking further to get wood, to get water. And so really these debt repayments are subsidized through labor. And we have to be deliberate also in understanding that this labor is mostly befallen on Black women. And so we also have to be cognizant of the fact that this labor has been deliberately invisibilized by the economic system. And so I think for a long time, African feminist scholars have raised these alarms, but now we're also coming to the point of the conversation where the same scholars are saying that women's care work is also becoming depleted. And so this is a real a break in the conversation. And so we have to think about how do we really build economies that not only sustain the planet and ourselves, but also replenishes the planet, the environment, and women's care work. And so the global debt regime survives because of women's unpaid care work, which stabilizes these collapsing public systems. And we also know that in Africa and global south, fossil fuels are not development. They are not a development tool, they are an entrapment tool. And this is, I think, Mehmet made a great example of showing us this. And so coming to the question on international cooperation, I think that the AFRIDAT, as it's approaching its 30th year in existence, we've really also dreamt up big dreams, as this paper is also allowing us feminist big dreams to turn that into reality. And so I think AFRIDAT offers two critical pathways for international cooperation, and it really does start on the continent, and this is where we want to build this up from. And so the first one is the African Borrowing Charter, and it's a simple but powerful assertion, and it's really saying that borrowing is an important tool in our development finance toolbox, but it should be used to serve sovereignty. It shouldn't be an entrapment tool, and it should finance structural transformation. It should be forward-looking, but also recognizing that the economy and its institutions are not neutral. And so we've also last year wrote a paper about reparations, which I think is an important part of the conversation, especially when we are considering the concepts of odious debt and also climate finance and reparations. We also have the AFRIDAT, the Maputo Manifesto, which applies an important and critical gendered lens to how borrowing should happen for African countries. And because we know that debt servicing and austerity hollows out public services, and it is women who then have to fill this gap. Women are made the de facto shock absorbers of economic crises. And so this model, this manifesto really asks us to look at this and to provide ways forward which are cognizant of this. And then I think last year was also an important year. We had the Lomé Declaration, and this calls for comprehensive debt cancellation and fair and transparent restructuring processes. As Mehmet has alerted us, we've seen what has happened in Ethiopia over the last few weeks. We also saw how private creditors stalled the debt negotiation processes in Zambia. So we're asking for these systems to change, for countries to have a fair and transparent mechanism for debt cancellation, for restructuring their debt. And then last year, coming out of the FFD process, we also had paragraph 50, which is then setting up this debtors club, which we've long asked for. So I do think that there are pathways towards international cooperation, but declarations aren't enough. What we need is also a sovereign multilateral debt workout mechanism under the United Nations. We need structural cancellations of illegitimate and odious debts. We need climate reparations. We need climate loans, which are transparent, which are concessional, and not debt accruing. We also need our public development banks and our finance institutions to be aligned to people's demands and needs and not industrial policy and capital. And lastly, we need a just energy transition that is financed through redistribution, reparations, and not through market-led borrowing. Sorry. And so I think Africa is over indebted because of the history. But I do think that organizations like Afrodad and the rest of the panel here are really offering pathways forward, because in this time of the old world and the new world, we really do need these constructive conversations and documents like this to kind of anchor us and provide us with a grounding and a path forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Riska, for everything you've highlighted and contrasting this, how much women's care work is becoming depleted and how we can build economies that actually sustain the planet and ourselves. That replenish the planet and ourselves. We are now going to circle back to Bemna to give the final reaction before coming to a close. So now over to you, Bemnet.
Thank you all so much. Really, really insightful. I will try to keep this short. But if we're serious about the feminist decolonial economy, international cooperation must focus on restoring fiscal sovereignty. What I mean by fiscal sovereignty is we shouldn't just be focused on just mobilizing new finance. One decisive lever is tax sovereignty. So what is tax sovereignty? Tax sovereignty is the right and ability of countries to set and enforce their own tax rules in the public interest, free from external pressure, corporate lobbying, or secretive rulemaking processes. So trillions exist in an under-taxed extreme wealth and multinational profit shifting. The problem is that many countries are either prevented from taxing it or politically captured into not doing so. Today, much of the profit generated from fossil fuel extraction, mining, agriculture, and digital services in Africa, Asia, and Latin America countries is not taxed in the places where that economic activity actually happens. So multinational corporations routinely shift profits on paper to low tax financial centers through internal accounting practices, trade misinvoicing, and tax treaties that favor wealthier countries. Many of these treaties were negotiated decades ago in deeply unequal contexts and continue to restrict the ability of developing countries to tax profits earned within their borders. They are not neutral instruments, right? They reflect colonial economic hierarchies. So for decades, the global rules enabling this system have largely been shaped through OECD-led processes, dominated by a small group of wealthy countries. Those rules prioritize the interest of countries where multinational corporations are headquartered rather than the countries where fossil fuels are extracted, goods are produced, and labor is performed. So when we come to the UN Tax Convention, it's a historic, honestly, I would say once in a generation opportunity to change this. For the first time, all countries are negotiating global tax rules on an equal footing. This creates the possibility of rewriting unfair and colonial tax treaties, ensuring multinational corporations pay taxes in the countries where fossil fuels are extracted and goods are produced, stopping trade misinvoicing and profit shifting, and ending financial secrecy. That allows profits to be shifted out of developing economies. It's also important to note that this process was the result of deliberate political organizing. The push for a UN tax convention was led by the African group of countries in the United Nations. African governments tabled the initial resolution that launched negotiations and have consistently advanced some of the most far-reaching radical proposals. Many of the most transformative elements in the current draft text originated from African states. This matters, right? It signals a shift in agenda setting power and creates a concrete opening for us African feminist movements to shape what comes next. So from a feminist lens, tax justice injustice is a structural impediment to gender justice. What states cannot tax wealth, we cannot tax wealth and corporate profit. They compensate through austerity, regressive consumption taxes, and extractive expansion. So this burden, as we've consistently seen, shifts into unpaid care work, precarious informal labor, and ecological depletion. So the good news is the money does exist. Research I helped produce at the Tax Justice Network shows that $2.6 trillion in additional tax revenue could be raised each year through a modest wealth taxes on the richest households and by ending cross-border corporate tax abuse. This amount is sufficient to finance climate transitions, loss and damage, and strengthen domestic public services at the same time. The idea that countries must choose between domestic development and contributing to climate finance is a false choice. The real constraint is not economic scarcity, but political will to tax extreme wealth and multinational profits fairly. As mentioned earlier, the fossil fuel treaty process represents a complementary effort, exploring international levies on fossil fuel producers and high-emitting economies to support global South countries implementing just transition strategies. So aligning these approaches with tax justice reforms could help ensure that those who have profited most from fossil fuels extraction contribute fairly to financing the transition. So international tax corporation must do 5 things, and I promise I'm done after this. So first, we must democratize global tax rulemaking. We have to shift global tax rules making to transparent and inclusive UN processes, rather than the opaque side-by-side deals we see are playing out by OECD-led negotiations. 2, we must restore taxing rights to dismantle structural injustice, ensure countries can tax economic activities that take place within their borders. Profits should be taxed where workers are employed, goods are sold, and assets are located, not shifted on paper to tax havens through artificial accounting or vague value creation rules that favor financial centers. 3, we must terminate exploitative colonial tax treaties, curb illicit financial flows, and implement the ABCs of tax transparency. So what are the ABCs of tax? The ABCs of tax transparency are information sharing and reporting mechanisms used by governments to track corporate profits and hidden wealth. A stands for automatic exchange of information, through which countries share financial data across borders. B stands for beneficial ownership transparency, which requires companies and trusts to disclose their real owners in public registers. And C, it's public country-by-country reporting, which obliges multinational corporations to disclose where they operate, generate profits, and pay tax. And number 4, we must tax extreme wealth, high net worth individuals, and multinational profits progressively. And lastly, we must make tax systems gender responsive and care centered. As we know, tax is not gender neutral. So we must embed, when we engage with frameworks like the UN tax framework, we need to engage and embed binding gender responsive standards in global and national tax rules. We must recognize care as a public good and human right. This means mobilizing progressive revenue to finance universal care systems, reduce women's unpaid labor, reward care workers with decent work, and ensure the representation in fiscal decision making. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bem, for everything that you've just shared. A second. Thank you so much for everything that you've just shared on the role of fiscal sovereignty and tax sovereignty to enable these just transitions you were speaking of, and the role that wealth tax can can play in actually mobilizing trillions of dollars so that everything that we felt is out of reach is actually finally possible. So thank you so much for sharing and for guiding us forward with all these powerful pathways out of the crisis. So we're going to close now, but again, if there's any Q&As left in the chat that you haven't been able to respond to, I just ask the speakers to please respond to the ones that speak to you. And I want to thank each and every one of you and give a massive thank you and appreciation to Bemnet for guiding us through this session and exposing so powerfully how debt injustice, gendered harm, and fossil fuel extraction have been holding our continent and our communities hostage, and actually carving out and mapping the ways out of the structural crisis. Thank you to you and Amira, who is our head of research and policy at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, for writing such an urgent and necessary piece of research that collects and platforms the wisdom and visions from the feminist leaders of our continent. Thank you to Dr. Mela from Shine Collab, to Morosi from Akina Mama wa Africa, to Riska from Afrodad, to all of you for sharing all your brilliant ideas and insights to guide us through this session and onwards. I honestly feel super inspired and lucky to be among all of you. I'm really inspired by the session. Thank you to Comic Relief and to Allison and her team for believing in this project and understanding how deeply such a piece of research like this needed to come out into the world to inform distinct futures. And thank you to Christine and Gracious for making the comms shine for this important work. Thank you to Liz for being the magic strings behind the scenes. Thank you so much to our incredible interpreters, Kiki, Pamela, and Heather, for making this session accessible to so many more people in French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And a huge thank you, as always, to our tech guru, Zoe, for holding this down, holding it together, and making it all feel so smooth. And a massive thank you to all of you for joining and being here with us and learning from all these amazing, powerful speakers. We are so excited that this report is now finally out in the world, and we hope that it informs your struggles, your campaigns, your world building, grounded in the wisdoms, the learning, the ideas and visions of African feminists. You heard from Bemnet how the Africa group is the reason behind the fierceness of the UN Tax Convention. So let's keep going, everyone. You can find the link. Hopefully someone will share. Oh, Zoe has already shared. To this new report. We encourage you to dive into it, read all the pages, share it far and wide across your networks. And I want to just say a big final thank you for participating in this session. I've seen a lot of requests in the chat. We will definitely share the recording with you on to everyone who registered for this. It will also be on the Fossil Fuel Treaty YouTube, and we look forward to staying connected with all of you so that we can build momentum to make these new worlds possible together. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.